When I last met with you all just a few weeks ago, October 21st, we explored the world of the 50s, which I said was best exemplified on TV by shows like Ozzie and Harriet, Father Knows Best. And the cultural norm of that day was to pretend that everything was always okay, no matter what. And all in all, it was pretty nice to live in a world where we never talked about death, and there were no child molesters, and wives were never battered by drunken husbands, and there was no such thing as alcoholism as long as everything stayed in the home. Everybody pretended that everything was just okay. And I went to Japan for one of my son's weddings in 1995, and I observed that Japan proclaimed itself to be a perfect society. If you check their official records, you quickly learn that there was no alcoholism, there was no child abuse, there was no spousal abuse, no homelessness, no AIDS. In sum, none of the problems existed that we face in the modern world. But if you just opened your eyes, you would quickly see that none of that was true. I remember seeing men in $1,000 suits passed out on the curb. You know, is there alcoholism? Of course. Is there child abuse? Of course. It's just that they weren't dealing with it. They had significant problems, and they simply didn't admit it. Now, that's exactly where we were in the 50s. And I don't fault Japan for that, because we did go through exactly that same thing, only we were years ahead of it. And when we look at the state of California now, just for example, we are absolutely bankrupt. We just don't admit it. Okay? Now, in my life experience, both as an individual and as an attorney, I've concluded that it's much easier to fix a problem if you admit that it exists. Because if you're in denial, then you'll never deal with the problem. But in order to fix it, one first has to identify the problem. So that's what we're going to do this morning. The problem we have been talking about in my last sermon and now this morning is discrimination. Whether it's based on color or sex or sexual preference, it doesn't matter. The issue of equality of women has proven especially difficult for me, and maybe that's because I grew up in the midst of the women's movement. So while I was taught in the 50s as a college student and a fraternity boy to open car doors for women and always have the exact change ready in case they needed it, and in those days to have a cigarette lighter available at all times, you might remember, okay? When I tried to do that in the 60s, and I opened a car door for a liberated woman, she slammed the door on my hand. So that gets confusing. It was difficult for everybody to try to figure out what the rules were and what the norms were as we went through this radical shift, and people came to grips with the idea that women were equal. How are we going to define that? How are we going to implement that? Well, we've all struggled with these issues, and this morning we're going to talk about it some more. And like most of my sermons, I have an idea of what I want to talk about, and I really don't figure it all out until the very end. So let's be patient with me, please. I hope it all makes some sense by the time we get finished. I think it will, but there's a lot going on in my mind, I have to tell you. Now, before I get into women, I wanted to give you a footnote to my last sermon, and that has to do with gay rights. In summary, I told you then that beginning with the case of Lawrence versus Texas in June of 2003, the United States Supreme Court, in a very stunning 6-3 decision, struck down the Texas law which had banned sodomy for homosexuals, but not heterosexuals. They ruled that it was unconstitutional because it violated the Due Process Clause. And then it went on further, and it effectively legalized gay sex by ruling that all sodomy laws in all states violated the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. More recently, as you all will remember, the California Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriages. And that was followed almost immediately by the implementation of Proposition 8, which was backed by people who didn't like same-sex marriage, and it won, but it won narrowly. And that was immediately challenged in the Federal District Court in San Francisco. It went to trial, and the judge there ruled that California's Proposition 8 was unconstitutional and that same-sex marriages was proper. Well, when the states began to approve same-sex marriages, the United States Congress, in its infant wisdom, passed what is called the Defense of Marriage Act. And among other things, that statute provided that persons of the same sex who were legally married were not eligible for any federal benefits that would normally be given to a surviving spouse. The practical effect of that was to punish those folks who were in same-sex marriages. Now, just 2 months ago, in the case of Windsor versus United States, the United States Circuit Court, or the Circuit Court of Appeals, sitting in New York, was presented with a case in which 2 women had been partners for over 40 years and were in a legally recognized same-sex marriage. And when one of them died, the survivor inherited her estate, but was required to pay over $350,000 in estate taxes. Those taxes would not have been imposed had it been a traditional marriage. Faced with those facts, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals struck down that portion of the Federal Defense of Marriage Act which prohibited the federal government from recognizing legal same-sex marriages. The decision was 2-1. The opinion was written by Chief Justice Dennis Jacobs, who was a conservative appointed by George W. Bush. He wrote the opinion for the majority, and it's extremely significant to me that Justice Jacobs wrote that opinion. Now, given those facts, I told you on October 21st the following, and I quote, I never get to do this, but I was right. So here's the quote. My prediction is, and you heard it here, that the U.S. Supreme Court will ultimately rule that almost any law that treats gay people differently in this country is unconstitutional and will be struck down. That sweeping ruling may not come in this term of the court, but it will absolutely come in the next 5 years. And without being political, but simply stating the obvious, that is especially true if Obama is reelected. Close quote. Now here we are 7 weeks later, and Obama was reelected. The polls as of Friday showed that this country has changed dramatically, and a majority of Americans now favor same-sex marriage. And so guess what happened on Friday? The U.S. Supreme Court announced that it would hear the California Proposition 8 case and the Windsor case out of New York in this term of the court. And what that means to all of us is that in March, oral arguments are going to be made to the court, and in June, decisions are going to be handed down. We know that there are 4 liberal justices on the Supreme Court who are going to vote in favor of same-sex marriage, regardless of the facts of the case. And we also know that there are at least 3 conservative justices on the court who are going to vote against same-sex marriage, regardless of the facts of the case. This is pure politics at the highest level. Having said all that, we don't know what Justice Kennedy will do. He's been the traditional swing vote. We have no idea. He wrote the decision in the 2003 case, but that had to do with criminal conduct, and for lawyers, these are very fine distinctions. We just don't have any idea what it's going to do. But we do have an idea what Justice Roberts is going to do. Now, that all being said, I'm going to make another prediction. This is it. The Supreme Court is going to uphold same-sex marriages by at least a 5-4 vote. And I say this because I think that Chief Justice Roberts is a fundamentally fair man, but he is also a very astute politician. He reads the polls. The country favors same-sex marriages, and his court is not going to go against that tide. I hope I'm right. Okay? That's the reason I think that he voted to support what is known as Obamacare, much to the dismay of conservatives. I think I'm right, but if not, it's only a matter of time. If one of the conservatives should leave the court during the next 4 years, I am positive that President Obama will appoint a justice who will vote for same-sex marriages. And it will then win by at least a 5-4 vote. There's no question this is coming. The only question is when. And we all know from our life experience that social change takes a lot of time. When the Founding Fathers wrote in the Constitution that all men are created equal, what they really meant, this is not what they taught us in school, what they really meant was that all men like us are created equal. And more specifically, the equality of the Constitution was restricted to men who were white, who were Protestant, and who owned property. I didn't get that in 2nd grade. Okay? Pretty simple once you know the rules. So if you're female, or if you're black, or you're not a Protestant, or you're not a property owner, then you were not given the rights protected under the Constitution. We like to say that our founding fathers were religious men, well versed in the Bible, both the Old and the New Testaments. They certainly understood the golden rule, except that their version was, he who has the gold rules. We have as a nation struggled for the last 240 years to expand the definition of equality that was so narrowly inserted into the Constitution. Little by little, inch by inch, we've dropped the religious requirement, and then we dropped the requirement for owning property, but we did not easily drop the white only or the men only requirements. Although the slaves were completely freed by 1865, individual states figured out countless ways to deny blacks the right to vote or the opportunity to get an education. And so we found ourselves 100 years later, in 1965, passing historic civil rights acts, which did nothing more than say that minorities have the same rights as the majority. That's all they said. So what did that mean? It meant that equality, even after it was legislated, still had to be physically enforced. Having a right that isn't enforceable is like not having a right at all. So if you say you have a right to attend an integrated school like the Supreme Court did in 1954, what we found was 11 years later, nobody had integrated. They had a right that wasn't being enforced. So in 1965, we had civil rights legislation, and you will all remember the National Guard escorting black kids into previously white schools. I'm thinking of James Meredith of Ole Miss. I can't forget that. It was a horrible scene. And it took the National Guard in full battle dress to escort black students into junior high schools and senior high schools and public universities. Now we've learned over the years that equality means not only rights, but the enforcement of those rights. And if you don't have enforcement, you don't have the opportunity. And when it comes to women, it was not until 1920, with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, that they were given the right to vote in national elections. That was not even 100 years ago. We all know people born before 1920. I know some in this room. Okay? Historically speaking, that's not a long time ago. What I'm about to tell you, I learned from Google and Wikipedia, which is now my substitute for the Library of Congress. And some of this is their language or their thoughts, and I want to give them credit for it, but I've tweaked it a little bit. It was a very long and a hard-fought battle for women to achieve the important milestone of the vote. And lest we forget, it took many generations of supporters for women's suffrage. They lectured, they lobbied, they practiced civil disobedience, just to achieve what many Americans at the time considered a very radical change to the Constitution. The battle had begun 80 years earlier, in 1840, appropriately enough as a result of a world conference on anti-slavery. It was held in London. It was attended by an American delegation which included a number of very smart, strong women. They were Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, among others, and they were forced to sit in the galleries as observers because they were women. And this poor treatment didn't rest very well with these women of progressive thoughts. So they decided they would hold their own convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious rights of women. They used the Declaration of Independence as a guideline. Remember, all men are created equal. Stanton presented her Declaration of Principles in her hometown chapel, and thus she began to bring to light women's subordinate status, and she made recommendations for change. 1840. 32 years later, in 1872, Susan B. Anthony tried to vote for Ulysses S. Grant as president, and she was arrested. 6 years later, in 1878, a woman's suffrage amendment was introduced to the U.S. Congress. Remember the date, 1878. It didn't pass until 1919. I can't do the math. 22-19. How much is that? 22 and 19? Anybody? 41? Whatever it is. 22 years in the 1800s and 19. 41 years. It took 41 years after it was introduced in Congress. The Congress was lobbied because women formed pressure groups. Women got together finally. They formed groups such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the National Council of Jewish Women, the National Association of Colored Women, the Women's Trade Union League. The women's movement had no end of groups of women that were forming together to come talk about why should we be second-class citizens. Never happened before, but it was a great thing. It lost steam during the 1890s and the early 1900s for various reasons. And by the time the U.S. was involved in World War I, it had slowed down considerably because beginning with around 1914 when the war started, women began to move into the labor force, albeit slowly, to take jobs that previously were held by men. They pitched in. The balance finally began to shift in favor of women's suffrage in 1918 when then-President Woodrow Wilson changed his position and he announced that he supported the amendment. And that did it. And in 1919, after all those years of petitioning, picketing, protesting, parading, the 19th Amendment was finally passed by both houses of Congress, and in 1920 it became ratified, and then they were allowed to vote in 1920. Listen to the text of the 19th Amendment, this radical change to the United States Constitution. Here it is. The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. How hard is that? Well, where do we go from here? In the 1920s, we had lots of problems, and there was no significant change in the status of women. It takes time. We were still a rural society, and women's place was still in the home, making babies and taking care of the house. In the 1930s, the next decade, we experienced the Great Depression, and there was no time nor was there any energy for a women's movement. Everything changed after World War II. Women had come out of their homes, they took jobs that had previously been filled by men. You name it, women did it. They were construction workers, heavy equipment operators, shipbuilders, dockhands, welders, and on and on and on. Many women were in the military, and some of them were officers. One of my good friends, one of our good friends' mother, was a captain in the Marine Corps. Okay, and she served in the Far East. When the war ended and women went back to their homes, it proved somewhat difficult to tell such women that they were second-class citizens. I grant you that the rest of the 40s and the 50s were not significant in outward gains, but women were changing, and they were changing the people around them. Many more were in the workforce than ever before, and they didn't like the way they were treated. One of my most poignant memories goes back to 1954 when my dad died. My mother had to go to work to support the family. And she held a master's degree in economics from one of the best universities in the country, so she didn't have any trouble finding a professional position, but she was only able to make 1/3 of the salary that men were making in comparable positions. It was very ironic to me that her employer was the National Council of Jewish Federations and Welfare Funds. Because to me, if anybody should have seen that discrimination, it would have been a national Jewish organization. But they didn't, because the mindset at that time was that women were underpaid. Pardon, I'm not saying it right. Men were paid more because they have to support their families. Anybody in here ever heard that? Okay. Now, 20 years later, in 1974, when my wife was employed as a staff accountant by a CPA firm in this town, she was then a single mom supporting her child, and she wasn't able to collect child support because her ex-husband was a deadbeat. So she observed pretty quickly that men in that firm were getting paid a higher salary than she was for the same work, and she was training those men for advancement. They got promoted, and she stayed at the same position at the same lower pay. So when she complained about it very nicely, because she's a nice lady, she was told, they have a family to support. Same line that my mother got 20 years earlier. Only this time, her boss told her a few days later that the firm really wanted her to dress more professionally. And her answer was very politely, when you pay me a professional wage, I will dress as a professional. I don't want to diminish her bravery, but things had changed a lot for women by 1974. We had changed drastically during those 20 years, beginning with the assassination of President Kennedy, going through the war in Vietnam, the influx of drugs, the hippie movement, many others. The women's movement, as we now know it, was born during the 60s and the 70s. And its leaders were women of power and wealth and education. The ones that come to mind for me are Gloria Steinem, Helen Gurley Brown, Katharine Graham of the Washington Post, and my personal favorite, Congresswoman Bella Abzug of the Crazy Hats fame. These women had a lot in common. They were articulate, they were focused, they were resolute, they were commanding, and they made it very clear to everyone that women did not have to be second-class citizens, and more important, they were not going to tolerate such treatment any longer. And they were right. They made a lot of noise, and little girls listened, and their mothers listened, and some of it even rubbed off on brothers and fathers. And in the years following 1964, everything changed. And we all know it, but I want to just give you some examples so we can keep this in focus. Just in my own profession of law, when I started law school in 1965, there were 151 people in my class. 150 were men, and one was a woman. And she didn't show up the second day. She dropped out, and it was too bad. 6 years later, in that same law school, 25% of the women of the students were women, and 20 years later, it was 50%. And when I started practicing law in St. Louis Obispo County, there were no women lawyers here, period. And in 1976, when I was public defender, I hired the first woman lawyer in the county, and she's still here, Tricia Ashbaugh, and she's now the public defender. She was the first. Women lawyers now comprise perhaps 40 to 50% of the total number of lawyers in St. Louis County. We have 5 or 6 women who are judges here. We have a woman who is Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. In medicine, I can't remember a single woman doctor from my childhood. I never knew one until perhaps the 90s. Now, women are probably 40 to 50% or more of the total doctors, and I have to tell you, I much prefer them. They're more nurturing. Okay? If any male doctors in the congregation, I apologize, but that's the way it is. Veterinarians, I don't ever remember meeting a female veterinarian until the 90s. I know there were a few, but I just never met them. And now I'm told that approximately 75% of the students in our vet schools across the country are women. 75%. In sports, it wasn't too long ago that women were shut out of sports journalism completely because the athletes and the team owners didn't want them to go to the locker room. And if you couldn't go to the locker room, you couldn't get the story because that's the place where the athletes talk. So they were cut out. Today, you could not tune in a professional sporting event on TV without seeing women reporters. They're everywhere. But they have not yet reached full equality in this field because the top spot in sports broadcasting are the 2 fellows who call the plays and give the commentary. And it doesn't matter what channel you're looking at, it doesn't matter what team it is, they're all men. I think this will. Does anybody doubt that this is going to change? No question. When I was in high school and college, there was no such thing as a women's team in a competitive sport. It didn't exist. I didn't even think in those terms. I didn't know girls could play basketball. You know? So girls played only intramural sports. There were no teams. And then along came Title V. And Title V said that if anybody wants federal funds in the school, they have to provide equal opportunities. Yes?
It's Title IX, right?
I'm sorry, Title IX. Thank you.
Sorry.
My math is terrible. I was 4. Okay, Title IX, thank you. If any school wants federal funds, they have to provide equal opportunities and facilities to women. Well, everything's changed. Now we have intercollegiate women's teams in a great many sports, and women are full-fledged members of co-ed teams such as swimming and track. They're getting athletic scholarships, which they could never get when there were no teams. And that couldn't have happened in the old days. It's happening. One thing that's not happening, I'm just going to point out, I have seen many men coaching girls volleyball or tennis or you name it, but I haven't yet seen a woman coach a men's team. So I'm just pointing out to you places where we still need some work. In religion, Judaism is like Christianity. We have many different branches, liberal, conservative, Orthodox, the whole bit. But prior to 1972, no woman was ever ordained as a rabbi in a Jewish faith. And when the first female rabbi took the pulpit in 1972 in a Florida synagogue, one old guy yelled out from the congregation, "A woman belongs on the pulpit like an orange belongs on a Seder plate." Seder plate is what we use at Carsel. And so guess what happened? We now have a new tradition. We put an orange on the Seder plate. And the reason is because a woman does belong on the pulpit. Now, since the 70s, a great many women have been ordained in most of the Protestant denominations and in 2 of the 3 major branches of Judaism. The Catholic Church remains the largest holdout. And it's ironic that it allows Episcopal priests who are married to become Catholic priests and retain their spouses. As you might expect, there's a large and vocal movement in the Catholic laity to allow women to become priests and also to allow priests to marry. This is going to be one of the great battlegrounds in our soon future. Unfortunately, the decision is made in Rome. It's not going to be decided in America. So it'd be interesting to me to follow what happens to the Catholic Church. In the military, I have a niece who graduated from Annapolis, probably 10 years ago, and was given a commission as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps, and she flew Apache helicopters in Iraq, and was in combat. But I don't know any other women in combat. I just happen to know her. She's now teaching Marines at Camp Pendleton how to fly helicopters. But for most women, they aren't allowed to go into combat. And what that means is that if a woman wants a career in the military, and they're admitted now to all the service academies and they get commissioned, but they aren't allowed to go normally to go into combat. And you cannot really get significant promotions in the military if you haven't had combat experience. So last week, I forgot the number, I think it was about 7 women who had served in either Iraq or Afghanistan filed suit in federal court to compel the military to allow women to go to combat. I'm predicting they're going to win. They had a choice of filing that suit in any court in the United States. And they picked the one judge who's going to rule for them. Okay? Very clever. That suit is going to be ruled in favor of women, and pretty soon, women are going to be in combat, and they should be. Okay. Now, in politics, the world I grew up in, there were no women in politics, none whatsoever. Once in a while, the widow of a deceased congressman would get appointed to fill out his term, but very few women got elected that I can remember. Today, both of our U.S. senators in California have been women for many years. Girls in my day never even thought about becoming president. Today, there's a brand new poll I read Friday that shows that Hillary Clinton has 70% favorable ranking. 70%, that's unbelievably high. She's way ahead with women, and 49% of the men in this country would vote for her. Now, she may not run in 2016, but it doesn't matter because she made history. And the reason she made history is that all of us now accept the fact that there is no reason whatsoever that a woman cannot be president. Okay? We made that shift. Now it just comes down to circumstances and the right woman and the right politics. But there will not be a barrier because of sex. Not anymore. Your church, this church, the United Church of Christ, has historically been the leader in the major social issues, such as gay rights, civil rights, and women's rights. I've said this before, I will say it again because I thank you for it. You were the first Protestant church in the world to condemn Adolf Hitler. Churches in the UCC can sanctify same-sex unions, And the church body, a synod, voted overwhelmingly 7 years ago, and I quote, in support of equal rights for all. That made the United Church of Christ the first major Christian deliberative body in the United States to make a statement of support for, and I quote, this quote, equal marriage rights for all people regardless of gender. And to put all this in perspective, we take all this history and we put it in perspective, and what it really comes down to is this. It's the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Most people, in my experience, know that, but they just give lip service to it. On the other hand, this church is really a great church. You belong to a great church because it historically has been the church which has showed the world what is the right thing to do. So it's incumbent upon you as individuals to take strength from that. You are supported by an international organization, if you will. And so as individuals, you and I must constantly be on guard for discrimination in any form. And then we have an obligation as religious people to do everything we possibly can in our power to eliminate it. And that way we will be doing exactly what God requires of us, which was said many, many years ago, 600 years before Christ, by the prophet Micah. That what God wants from us is to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God.